Okay, I want to go ahead and get started with some introductions as we're waiting for a few more people to come on. Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning. Obviously everyone's putting in the chat where they're from. And we've got people from all over, so that's pretty cool. My name is Meredith. I am running technical assistance today. So if you have any issues with that, you can chat me and let me know and I'll do my best to help you out. I've got a couple logistical things to go over before I turn it over to our lovely presenter today. The first thing is this webinar runs for an hour, about an hour and a half, and we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. So if you have questions, there is a box at the bottom. You can submit questions, and we're going to be kind of collecting them and curating them throughout the webinar and try to make sure we get to all of those at the end. The second thing is that closed captioning is available. You can turn that on and off at the bottom as you like, to set to your preference. And then the last thing is we are recording this webinar and it will be available later on Southern Region's YouTube page, and we'll send out more information about that later. But I think that's all I have. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can chat me and let me know and I'll do my best to help you. But I'm going to give it over to Karen to introduce us today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Hangartner, and I'm the project director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, and thrilled to have you all here today. It's great looking at where everybody's from. We've got somebody from Guam, Washington, Texas, everybody from all over. So it's great to see you all there, and it's great to see some familiar names in that chat box. We are thrilled at Southern Regional to be able to bring you this webinar today with one of our favorite people, Kelly Wilson. I met Kelly, gosh, Kelly, it's been a long time ago now. I was actually sent to the Tennessee State Conference to scope out Kelly Wilson because she was a TFCBT trainer, and at Southern Regional, we were thinking about doing some work around this. Kelly, you probably don't even remember this. And so I went to her workshop to listen to her present, and then introduced myself, and we had lunch together and talked a little bit about what would it look like for Southern Regional to begin working with her. 2 learning collaboratives later, and a whole lot of years, probably 10, lots of bottles of wine. Kelly and I are still brainstorming and love thinking together about how to support mental health work in the CAC world. So I think she's a great presenter with a lot of experience, and a lot of experience working with clinicians at CACs. And so one of the things I want to point out, we are going to have lots of time for Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box and there's a chat box. If you really want to make sure we get to your question, put it in the Q&A box. We're watching the chat and I'll try to pick those up too. But, the Q&A box will for sure get your question answered, and we'll try to catch everything in the chat too. But this particular thing, one of the things that we know that in the CAC world is that oftentimes we've got executive directors who are supervising a mental health program or a clinician, a single clinician. And how do you provide that supervision if you're not a clinician yourself? How do you know that they're doing good work? How do you know that they're practicing with fidelity to the model that they've been trained in? And so I remember, Kelly, you probably don't even remember this. We did 2 learning collaboratives back in the day, and Kelly was on faculty with that. And Kelly worked with the supervisors in those learning collaboratives. And I remember you telling me, Kelly, years ago that you really felt like investing in supervisors was such an important aspect to ensuring stability in a mental health program and fidelity to the model, because they're the ones really supporting those clinicians in this work. And so what that looks like when you're not a clinician, is something that we'll be exploring today. So Kelly, thanks for being here again and always being such a willing thought partner around how we can serve kiddos better in the CAC world.
I really like that thought partner thing. And Karen, it's been about 16 years. And I had no idea that you were sent to scope me out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So,
yep. Sent with explicit instructions. Go meet her and talk with her. Yeah.
I may have been nervous if I'd known that up front. So everybody, I am Kelly Wilson. I'm coming to you today from Madison, Wisconsin. Obviously with my accent, that's not where I'm from. I born and raised in South Mississippi and happily going home for Christmas where it's going to be about 72 degrees versus 32 degrees here. So I am a Southern transplant. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been working in children's mental health since 1992, which is horrible. That's almost 30 years. And I have been a supervisor of many mental health programs. So school-based, outpatient, trauma-specific therapeutic foster care, home-based, really looking at how do we serve every kid. And when evidence-based practice came along, really pushing it out through the learning collaborative model, even figuring out what that was, my goal was every child in Mississippi should have access to evidence-based practice. They should have access to the scientifically researched, we know this will work, practices. And I am still working toward that goal. And now it has become nationwide for me and worldwide for some others. But we did use, and Karen came and scoped me out after this. So National Child Advocacy Center, we were at Catholic Charities in Jackson, Mississippi. We were a part of that for many years. And then I left and went into private practice, and I've been an affiliate for many years. But NCTSN was the first group to take Institute for Healthcare Improvement's learning collaborative model and put it into place. And that's what Karen was referencing. We did 2 learning collaboratives, full-on learning collaboratives. Today, there's a lot of learning communities are called collaboratives. The difference being what we did was really looking more at organizational change with LANYAP. If any of you know what LANYAP means, everybody up here just looks at me crazy. But the extra being, we had trained TFCBT therapists. That was the LANYAP. The purpose was, how do we bring evidence-based practices into CACs? What is the organizational structure for that? And so we spent a lot of time meeting with supervisors. And Karen's right, I really considered them to be the linchpins for fidelity and for maintenance. Natchez. And for maintenance of a model. The other part is we spent a lot of time with executive directors, or senior leaders, as we call them, looking at how does an organization create the space for the use of an evidence-based practice. And so training is one thing. People can get training all day long and go back to where they are and do what we call treatment as usual. What is it that helps keep them from drift? And it's not that they're a bad clinician. It's that any of us, if we're not monitoring something, tend to drift. I think I'm supposed to be sharing my screen. We tend to drift. And an example of this is, wrong right here, Weight Watchers. So some of you may know about Weight Watchers, some of you may not, but I have graduated from Weight Watchers many times and should return for another master's degree, but we'll see. Or any diet program or any physical fitness program, any program you take on, any learning a second language even, how do you know you're making progress? And it comes down to measurement and accountability. So with Weight Watchers, you go in and the first thing you do is step on a scale. And there's one person who's watching, and it's real secretive for everybody else. They don't get to know if you lost or gained unless you tell them, but that one person always knows. And they'll write on a card, plus 1.5 pounds, minus 0.05 pounds. And those are always like, bam, minus anything, right? So celebrating all successes. And that happens. And you learn how to watch what you're eating and stay within whatever their guide is. But then I stopped going to Weight Watchers. And I don't have that person who's watching and writing down every little thing. And I start to drift. Yeah, a cup of something becomes a cup and a quarter of something, because I'm measuring it more by sight, more by feel. I can have ice cream because I worked out yesterday a little bit. Or maybe I can have ice cream because I probably will work out tomorrow. So we're looking at that drift, which is a natural human tendency. When we learn something and we start learning other things, incorporating everything is part of the way we see the world. How do I take in everything and put it together? Same thing happens with therapy. When we have evidence-based practices coming in, we're going to today define what is fidelity and why is that so important? And why are some people so worried about the rigidity of it, when that's not what fidelity is about. It's not about, did you do A, B, and C in session 1, 2, 3. So the other part of today is, how do you guys know that in a session, there's fidelity occurring, that's what's happening? Because you're the person who's doing the weighing and writing it down on a card, but you don't get to go with me throughout the week and know how I know what decisions I make as far as food. You can just tell me, are you doing good? Are you kind of backsliding? Or, look at this, but you're not there for the day-to-day choices. Same thing if you're supervising an evidence-based practice. Part of the anxiety that's happened is people are like, I don't want anybody in my session with me. I don't want people opening the door to see exactly what I do. Therapy's sacred, therapy's magical, therapy's all these things. And evidence-based practice says, we're not going to sit in there with you, but you're going to show us. You have an ability now, you have the tools now to show us what you're doing. And so it leaves room for art and science. It doesn't say a clinician can't bring in their own style. It doesn't take away a clinician's ability to build rapport, and their style with that. It doesn't take away from creativity or using different tools and techniques. What fidelity does is it says you have to at least replicate the core components in the way that they were meant to be, that they have been researched to be used, and in the timeframes they've been researched to be used. So this is kind of a broad overview of what we're going to do today. And you'll see that on there is clinical supervisor and the many roles that supervisors hold and administrators hold. But if you're at a site and you don't have a clinical supervisor on board, you have to think, how do I bring this in? What can I enrich? What are the core parts that my agency, my site, need to beef up or need to become creative in filling or finding a solution for? So you've got the administrator piece down, maybe. You've got supervisor piece down, maybe. How do we supervise? And supervise to teach different things and supervise to be a mentor. But do I have that clinical supervisor who has expertise in the model I'm trying to implement? And that's where the breakdown sometimes comes. Do I have that? And so it's not toss the baby out with the bathwater. We just won't do it because we don't have a supervisor. It's where we look at small test of change. If you go back to a learning collaborative model, how do I bring in creatively, efficiently, and effectively what's needed to help my clinician deliver the evidence-based practice we are promoting, we say we're using. And so some of today will be around barriers. What are my barriers? What are my roadblocks? What are my stopping points? Because that's way more important when you're trying to introduce change than what do we have right. what do we have right is great and wonderful, but we don't know where change needs to be unless we really take a look at what do we not have, or what do we have that may be a little crooked. So as an organization, what do you do? As an organization, you have to say, we are using evidence-based practices, or we are using this specific evidence-based practice. And you have to start at the very beginning when you hire someone. We're going to do evidence-based practice. Are you willing to do that? Are you up for that? So the use of a model with fidelity really starts at hiring. It starts at the very beginning. And is it concreted, which I don't think is a word, but concreted, is it cemented? That might be better, cemented. You have to cement your expectations so that they're really solid, so people know what's being asked of. So then we go to, okay, so I'm hiring somebody and I'm telling them we use evidence-based practice. In their job description, I'm outlining how we use evidence-based practice, how this will be monitored, how it will be checked. What are your expectations? To do that, you have to have a plan for how do I onboard staff. So I'm not gonna be able to go out there and get staff who are certified in everything, get clinicians who are certified in everything. So what if I'm thinking I'm going to get a clinician trained today? You also have to be thinking about, and I'm still going to use this model 10 years from now. And the likelihood of me maintaining that clinician is not as great as the likelihood of me having somebody else in here by then. So what is your onboarding process? How are you going to train up clinicians? And how are you going to use the information you've gleaned from how this model or these models work in your particular site? How are you going to pass that down to the next clinician? How are you going to hand down learned learning points? You have to do that through fidelity monitoring. We don't want to hand down watered down evidence-based practices because they just get weaker and weaker. So when we think I'll have one clinician train the next clinician coming on board, or I'll have a clinician who really works with student interns and helps them become faithful to the model or pick up and learn a model. That is one way to think about onboarding. But then you have to say, is it really the model? How do I know? How do I know when I write in a grant? How do I know when I tell somebody? How do I know when I talk to community stakeholders that, yes, we are actually doing this? So it comes down to fidelity monitoring. And with that, we have to think, well, what is fidelity? What in the world is that? And the basic definition is faithfulness to a person, cause, or belief, demonstrated by continuing loyalty or support. The other piece of fidelity is the degree of exactness with which something is copied or replicated or reproduced, the degree of exactness. When we think about fidelity to an evidence-based practice in the clinical room, we're looking at the degree of exactness to which it's replicated or reproduced, because the evidence base has said, if you do this in this way, on this time frame, meeting these core components and the focus, then you should have good results. So it's not, do I prove that the children and families we're serving get better? It's, do I know that they're actually receiving the treatment that we set out to deliver? So clinicians and in practice are thinking the degree of exactness to which something is copied or reproduced. As above the clinician, the supervisors, the executive directors, the organizational leadership, I want you to think about fidelity as the faithfulness to a cause. What is your faithfulness to the cause of? implementing evidence-based practices. What is your faithfulness? And so then we take it, there's fidelity increases the likelihood of obtaining the results we're looking for. And that's what we're saying, that we are faithfully committed to helping a clinician move toward exactness and reproduce what is evidence-based to work for these kids and families. If we don't follow fidelity, the tend with the drift is toward what's called treatment as usual, or cherry picking. So I'll use TFCBT. It's got some really good components in it that if you took the TF away would be called CBT, just CBT. So if I'm monitoring fidelity to a trauma-focused model, not so much modeling fidelity to what are the techniques that are used, more monitoring fidelity of, are they being used in the right way for the right purpose? So there is room for the art of therapy, but does that stay true to what actually makes this work? That's what fidelity is. It's, are we staying true to what the evidence says makes this particular intervention work? Not what did you do in session 1, 2, or 3. And in order to do that, administration really has to think about, what treatment are we going to use? And so the organization at this point has to look at their users, their customers, the people we serve, and say, which model works? Because there's a lot of EBPs out there and people tend to just go get them one. Like, okay, I got an EBP. All right, we're rolling. But does it actually fit, one, the population you serve, right? 2, is it doable? So I've gone out there and I've got myself DBT or multisystemic therapy, and I've got a team of 1 providing this service. Then that's a setup to fail, because you don't have the elements that are required for that clinician to actually maintain fidelity, or for your agency to maintain fidelity. So you have to know, do an organizational assessment and know, what do I want to use? What's the one that matches here? What's one that we probably can make work? You have to know an organizational piece of, how are we going to support that? Not in the room, but how do we support that? How do we promote that? How do we say that's what we're doing and actually know we're doing it? You have to maintain focus. One of the biggest places where we lose fidelity when we think of organizational support is when the organization is all hot and excited. Woo, we're going out there to learn this evidence-based practice. And then 4 months later, it's like, whoo, we're going out there to learn this other practice. And then 4 months later, it's like, whoo, I don't care what you're doing. We just got to get this grant written. And, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? So as a supervisor, as a manager, as those things, what is your focus? You can't maintain 100% focus on, are we delivering the CBP with fidelity? But you have to keep some focus on it. We know that what we pay attention to, we do. If we stop paying attention to it, we drift. So how do you pay attention to it? How do you really think about what we're doing and maintain that skilled clinician? Some of the things we know from the learning collaborative approach and other research is there has to be ongoing training. You can't train somebody in something once and they know it and they do it. So there has to be some kind of ongoing training. It's why in a learning collaborative model, we keep the consultation calls where you're actually meeting with a consultant, meeting with a trainer in that model on a monthly basis for a year. Because there's a lot that's learned outside of those 2 to 3 to 5 days when a training happens. Therapy of any kind, mental health services of any kind, really is a learning by doing process. Now, there's a lot of graduate schools out there who send out masters in mental health professions who have never actually had a clinical session with someone. And that was me. I went to the University of Southern Mississippi. I got my master's in social work. I was doing great. I was excited. I was wonderful. I went to Catholic Charities. They said, okay, here's your caseload. I got the first kid in. We sat in a room and I was like, now what? What do I do? Like, I know the theory. I know the plan. I know the goals. But what do I do? So a lot of it is learning on the job. And that's why you need to maintain a skilled clinician, you need to have ongoing support of some sort. One way this happens is when we have a supervisor who's also trained in the model and becomes an expert in the model and can really provide that ongoing learning. The other, if that's not there, you have to think, okay, how do I help my clinician or clinicians access information as it becomes? Because you're wanting to create a learning environment. One thing that maintains employees, one thing that maintains mental health therapists at a particular agency is they feel like they're effective. So there has to be recognition that, yeah, what you're doing is, one, needed, and two, what you're doing is effective. The other way to maintain, the other piece that has proven out to maintain clinicians is having a learning environment. I don't get stuck in a rut. I continue to learn. I continue to learn, and we can say, well, here's some books, and here's some notebooks, and here's some webinars, and here's some stuff. But the learning environment is I'm talking to other people at my organization about what's being learned and where are learning points we want to move toward, and what did they know. Learning Collaborative really brought into focus that when there's a group sitting in front of me, and I've been training TFCBT since 2006, there's more knowledge of how to make that evidence-based practice work in a CAC setting than there is in front of the room. There's more knowledge in the participants than in the front of the room. I bring TFCBT. You guys, or my training audience, brings whatever's going, where and how, what is the crucible this is going to be used in. Same thing when we work with families, right? We bring expertise in mental health parts and development. The family brings, my dog's snoring. The family brings, what are the considerations that are going to be needed to make this work in this particular family, in this particular setting, before or after this particular natural disaster or whatever's happening. Natural disaster should be whatever's happening. So how do you create a learning environment where your clinicians feel like they are still being fed, they're being enriched, they're getting deeper in what they do? And how do you recognize and promote that learning? So if I check a clinician's, are they doing fidelity to the model? Yeah. Are they doing fidelity to the model? Yeah. Are they doing fidelity to the model at a deeper level? Are they doing fidelity to the model that's more individualized to the kid and family, or to the community, or to the multidisciplinary team's needs? So how do I do that? And one thing that leadership can do is celebrate and motivate. You got to maintain that focus, but you also have to celebrate. This is what's going on. And as directors and supervisors in the pandemic, right, where everybody is is already stressed and walking around with toxic stress, and needs are greater than we have clinicians to meet or services to meet. We've seen the abuse and neglect cases go up. We've seen suicidal ideation and suicide rates go up. We've seen stress in families and divorces, all of this go up. And we have lost clinicians usually. There hasn't been a big boom into the clinician world. How do we motivate them? As leaders, you know that there's some motivational interviewing that has to happen. Whether you're a mental health professional or not, if you're the leader of an organization, you know motivational interviewing. It's how when somebody comes in and says, we're just pissing on a forest fire. I don't understand why we're doing this. There's what, the waiting list is way too long. I'm ineffective. Motivational interviewing and celebrating to come back to, how do we really focus on the tree in front of us? Not the whole forest fire, but the tree in front of us. We have to put out that first and then work on the next one and then work on the next one. So the celebrating successes can help come back to the focus on the particular client, child, and family of the moment in that session. So we can celebrate across big successes in an organization, but how do we really recognize the hard work that goes into a client that may have compounding factors, may have ongoing violence, or may have ongoing stressors, or may have special needs of another sort? How do we actually tell our clinicians, you're doing a good job with that family? Because that's what matters. You can tell me I'm doing a good job all day long, but if you don't know what I did in that day and recognize that, then you're just somebody else saying, hey, Kelly, have a great day. So how do we pay attention to the individual parts and celebrate and motivate? Because that's what's going to prevent drift, all of the things I've talked about. One way is in performance evaluations. Really looking at, what did people do? So is the evidence-based practice that you're wanting to put into place, is it embedded in the performance evaluation? Starts at the hiring, goes into the job description, and then how is it evaluated on an ongoing basis? So something I'm saying is very important is metrics, data. How are you getting the data that you need to really say, we're implementing this model and we're doing it with success? And this particular clinician has been successful this amount of time with this amount of families. Look at that. That's great. That's wonderful. Or what up with that? So the evaluation, and we talked some about preparing for the future. What am I going to do with the next clinician that walks in the door? How am I going to get them trained up and ready? This particular slideshow is about supervision. And I understand that we're on a webinar where might be non-clinical people who are supervising. But this is a way to explore and look at, okay, where are my bumps in the road? What's going on with bumps in the road? What do I need to focus on? What do I need to beef up? What do I not know what in the hell it even is? And I need to ask Karen or Meredith and figure out what's going on. So like I said, I really feel like the supervisor, that's your key. If you don't have a clinical supervisor, figuring out how to have somebody who knows whatever model you're trying to implement and is able to guide your clinicians. Where do you find expertise? It might not be in your organization, but maybe it's in your region. It might not be in your organization, but maybe it's accessible. If a few different CACs go together and hire a consultant. It might not be in your organization, but where is it? So you got to have some clinical supervision in there. If you put just a single clinician, what we know is if you send a single clinician to training and they get trained, that was a good 2 days. And then if they come back and they don't have supervision, or organizational support, they become frustrated, more and more frustrated, and they're more likely to leave you and go somewhere where they can get. When I worked at Catholic Charities, we were a nonprofit. You guys understand that. We had no money. Your job duties ranged everything from providing child and family therapy to cleaning the bathroom to changing the light bulb. And when people came in, I could say as a supervisor, as a program director, I can't give you the highest salary. I can't give you the best benefits. I can give you some perks because at Catholic Charities, you get holy days off. So, that's kind of cool. But what I can give you is in your time here, you will become a better clinician. And I was able to maintain clinicians mostly because when we did their evaluations and when they would come into supervision, it was, I'm learning. I know I'm better than every family and child I serve. I get better. But it takes really pointing out, what did you learn from this case? Not just what did you learn from trainings, but what did you learn from this case? What did you learn from this experience? What is the ongoing assessment? Another part of it is really the areas of clinical strengths and weaknesses. You want a person who is clinically knowledgeable to be able to point out, what are the clinician's weaknesses? What are their growth spots? We know that in mental health, we tend to promote whoever's doing a good job. And so if you're a really good therapist, you get to be the supervisor. And that's wonderful. We also know in mental health, we're here to help people. We're here to make people's lives better. We're here to help people get back on track. We're moving people toward positives, which can sometimes make us really suck at giving critical feedback. We are the field that's least prepared to give feedback because we want to understand everything. We want to have compassion for everything. And it's not a bad thing to give that critical feedback. Here are your weaknesses. Here's where you need to really go out and learn or practice or seek additional training, or where we need to help you get additional training. So really looking at what are the barriers, where are the roadblocks in developing a clinician and helping a clinician to become the best they can. So when you're doing an evidence-based practice, you have a very good ruler to judge by. It gives you accountability to a certain set of measurements that can then highlight, what are the strengths? What are the knock them out parts this clinician's got? But where might there be improvement? And without a need for improvement, we don't have a learning environment. We just have a, yeah, I'm doing a good job, whatever. So where's the traffic cop, if you will, the person who says, wait, stop, go this way, go that way. You also have to stay as a visionary. Because if you work in mental health services in a CAC, if you're a clinician or a supervisor, the mired down or the muckety muck of the day can really start to weigh on you. How are we bringing clinicians into that organizational process of, this is where we're going? This is where we're going. And how do we give them a voice to say, this is where I want to go? These are some things I have. So keeping that vision there, facilitating, and finding a team. If I'm going to push a rock up a hill, which sometimes that's what it feels like when doing therapy with traumatized kids and families, if I'm going to push this big stone up the hill so that it can get some traction and roll on its own, who's my help? Who can hold the stone in place when I need to breathe? Who can add a little push when we hit a bump? We do better when we are learning something And when we're implementing something, evidence-based practice, if we have some sense of team, doesn't mean you have to go out and hire 4 more therapists. It means you have to look at, okay, where's the team? What is the team? Move out and past that one. Where's the team? Who else is in this? So maybe you're not a clinical supervisor. Maybe you're not a clinical supervisor. That's okay. You've gone out and you're looking for some expertise. You're going out and looking for ways to bring that in. But on a day-to-day basis, you're not clinically oriented. And you have about 8 million other kind of administrative things going on over here, right? Or you got all kind of other supervision you have to do. Creating that environment of learning. How are you learning with your clinician? How are you learning more about the model you're working with? What do you do to keep things fresh? So thinking as fidelity monitoring, what do I do? What do I do to keep things fresh and different? What do I bring in? What is the updated research on this? Have I read the latest articles that say how this can be used or might be used? Do I know the places where it's being used? So really showing your commitment to the model creates that buzz that shows to clinicians, we're committed to this. We're going to look at it. We're going to look at it as a flexible thing. We're going to look at, and we're also going to be open to what else might need to be there. What else might need to be going on? So as leadership, when you're thinking about what exactly do I need to have to get an evidence-based practice put in place, you have to have selection. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? What are the results I'm looking to achieve? Got to have selection. You've got to have a learning environment or competency building. We can feel really confident and then a family quit on us and we feel like, good Lord, what did we do? Well, a supervisor will say 40 to 60% across the board, families and kids aren't going to complete mental health treatment. So you didn't do anything. Hopefully you didn't do anything, but let's look at what was right and what maybe got off track. So normalizing that there is the tendency for dropouts, but also recognizing when they're being maintained and tying that back to the evidence-based practice you're using. Something that's happened in mental health many times is kids and families have dropped out. But when you ask dropped out of what, there's not an answer. What did they drop out of? How did they even know they were in something? Did they know that they finished or didn't finish? Right? And so the big push was like, you got to do individualized treatment plans. Everybody's got to do individualized treatment plans. Well, that became fun. Individualized treatment plans. Well, you got to be strengths-based. You got to point out a family or a kid's strengths. So we started doing that, and ran down to a list that we could pick from, kind of drop down box. And families where did they go? They dropped out. What they didn't have was, this is what we're doing. This is what I recommend as an expert. This is what we see. So starting at your agency with assessment. Is there good clinical assessment? There has to be good clinical assessment. Not every kid and family walking through the door needs the same thing, or is that the same starting point? So as I'm building a competent clinician, I'm going to start with, how do we bring people in the building? How do we bring people? What is the intake process? What do we do to really set up from the start that we're trauma focused, trauma informed? Trauma informed always drives me nuts because everybody can be trauma informed, but we're trauma focused. And you're coming in, and this is going to be a place where you can get help. As mental health agencies, especially CACs, we are good at creating that homey environment. We are good at making people feel at home. They can come in. I love CACs that are in old houses. You come in, you hang out, you belong here. We love you, we accept you, we're there. That's really good. But is it helping me get better? So Tony Manarino, one of the developers of TFCBT, has really brought to the forefront that rapport building is not, do you like me? It's, do you believe I can help you? Do you believe I can help you? If you think about, if you had a rare disease and there was one doctor in the region who really knew how to treat that disease, do you care if they're snippy or have a great bedside manner? It'd be nice if they did, but you just do what's proven to work, doc, because I'm only with you for a short time. So we want clients to be comfortable. We want clinicians to have positive regard and be warm. But if I'm going to stay with something, if I'm going to continue to drive to see that specialist, I got to know they know how to help me. And that's the importance of doing assessment and saying, this is what we see. And then really explaining, this is the approach we're going to take. We're going to use an evidence-based practice. It's been proven to work. It's worked, with X amount of people. It's worked in different settings. So educating the family on, we actually know what we're doing. A lot of kids and families that come to us, they've been to a lot of therapists, or at least another therapist before. And so they come in with an expectation of what therapy is going to be like. What we want to do is send kids and families out, and the next time they go to a therapist, if they have to, or if they need to, or if they decide to, they say, what are we going to do? What's the model? We want to teach people to be good brokers, even if they don't stay with us to the end. We want to teach people to be good brokers. We also need to teach them to be good clients. And being a good client or a good recipient of, and I don't think anybody really receives mental health care. I think we participate in it together. But to really join in and partner with the work, there has to be an endpoint. An evidence-based practice has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There has to be an endpoint. And the clinician knowing the endpoint, the kid knowing the endpoint, the family knowing the endpoint is really motivating. It's not like we're just going to get in here and do this forever. So how do we help our clinicians bring that knowledge of and introduce the evidence-based practice to the kids and families? You on an organizational level, you're doing it out there to stakeholders, you're doing it out there to funding sources. How does that clinician deliver? This is the
Kelly, can I jump in here and ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
So part of this is a question that somebody's put in the Q&A chat. And as I'm listening to you talk about assessments, and you mentioned earlier about metrics too. So if I'm a CAC executive director and I'm thinking about what, as I'm evaluating a therapist and whether or not they're doing a good job, and know that there are metrics. What are those metrics that I'm looking for? And I'm wondering if it's tied to this assessment process too.
It is.
Which is why I jumped in now. So can you talk a little bit about what are the metrics we're looking for that we know if the therapist is doing a good job?
Right, that's where we were going. Thank you though. So you got to have the assessment, and then you got to know the components of the evidence-based practice that indicate fidelity. What is that beginning, middle, and end? Evidence-based practices have a time frame. Is it done within this time frame? Is there assessment ongoing that says if it's working or not? And at what point do we know, yeah, this was successful? Now, you can treat PTSD all day long or post-traumatic stress symptoms all day long. They're never going to go totally away. If you've had something happen in your life that was overwhelming, if you've been traumatized, you're always going to remember it. You're always going to be able to get triggered to it. But how do we know when good enough is good enough, right? And expecting. So that does bring us back to that supervisory team. And what do we do? What are the metrics? Metrics are first finding baselines. What is the baseline? We're really good at saying this is how many clients we served. This is how many children and families we served over the course of a year. Assessment brings you to this is how many children and families we served who needed this particular evidence-based practice. This is how many children and families we served who didn't need that level of care, but maybe needed something else. So maybe we're looking at, can we put a group process in, or can we bring another evidence-based practice that meets their needs? So assessment says everybody walking in the door at a CAC doesn't need the same thing. So you have to have a baseline. This is the evidence-based practice I've chosen. Who are the people that walk through the door who need it? What is the percentage of people who need it? Is there a percentage of people who need something else? So then you have a metric that you can evaluate an employee on. Does their assessment run roughly with the statistics you have or the national statistics? One of my, I'll say favorite things, but it's like least favorite things, is when I have a clinician on a consultation call who says, I don't have any trauma cases. I'm like, you're flipping kidding me. If you are a mental health professional in any kind of community-based service, CAC, mental health center, hospital, school-based services, there's an 80% likelihood that trauma has occurred and is underlying at least some of the symptoms. And so we want to clean up the trauma piece to see what else might really be there. So is your clinician who's doing the assessment, are they running along the same numbers that you would see nationally or that you've seen historically at your site? So how many people came in the door? How many were assessed with which assessments? Of those that were assessed, how many moved into what type of treatment? Of those who moved into a particular treatment, how many sessions, well, not necessarily sessions, how do I know that in different sessions, the clinician focused on what was needed? So it's not just a session by session, but it's a phase of treatment by phase of treatment by phase of treatment. And that's going to bring you back to fidelity checklist. You can't be in the office. You can't be in the room. And even if you were, you might not be able to measure fidelity, but keeping fidelity checklist can help you look into a particular case and say, are we using this model? Back to TFCBT. We have straightforward post-traumatic stress presentation. We're looking at 12 to 16 sessions. If we have complex trauma, we're going to look at 24 to 28, but nobody stays in trauma-focused therapy of any sort forever. If we do, then we're actually causing harm because we don't let them focus on anything else. So how many people walked in the door? How many were assessed? How many moved into this model? How many in this model checked out for fidelity when they terminated services? So we used to think that one of the metrics was how many graduations did you have? How many people completed that particular model? And then we realized that's not fair because a lot of times the clinician has no input into, do they change schools? Do they move away? Is there a hurricane? And now nobody's still here that was here to start with. Yeah. Was there a pandemic and how many people had internet services and how many didn't? So it's not how many graduated, but how much fidelity was followed throughout the thing. So if we take fidelity to a model and we take TFCBT, phase 1 of treatment. What was the focus? And the focus should be on any trauma treatment, should be on stability and skill building. Do the notes reflect that? Does the fidelity checklist reflect that? Do the notes reflect that? Does the treatment plan reflect that? But stability and skill building. And then that needs to be tied directly to trauma reenactments or trauma re-experiences or trauma coping skills. So did we find the trauma? Did we look at stability and skill building? Then the second phase of a good trauma model is the narration, however it's done, whether it's verbal or not, the narration and processing, the integration and processing, right? Was that trauma experience focused on and processed in a way that the child and family make meaning of it that moves them forward rather than holds them back? This happened, my whole life screwed up. This happened, I survived it, and I can move forward. And then the last phase of a model, and this is where a lot of fidelity falls out, is people will go through the processing of a trauma and then they say, hey, you graduated. But the last phase of a model is sticking with a kid and family long enough to see if they're integrated the skills. Can they take them out into the world? Can they use them without us? And so we're constantly working for, we're here, we're co-regulating, we're keeping you, but we're handing you off. We're working ourselves out of a job. And another metric you can have, since graduations give you some information, but not a lot, you can compare graduation rates among clinicians in the same area. But how many phases of treatment did they complete? And did they meet the goals of that phase of treatment? And that's going to require you as a supervisor, in whatever capacity you are, it's going to require you as a supervisor to know what are the goals of each phase of treatment. How long should each phase of treatment last? So a lot of it's going to be education, but there are fidelity checklists for any evidence-based practice. So an evidence-based practice includes assessment to say it's needed, core components that make it work, proven research to make it work, a structure in which they're delivered, what is the order, and then a good evidence-based practice says there's integration of skills. And it's done within a certain time frame. So those are your metrics. How many people walked in the door? How many were assessed? How many moved into this particular model? Of those that moved in this particular model, another metric I would put in there is how many stayed for 4 or more sessions, because we know there's 40 to 60% dropout rate, but we know most of those drop out in the first 2 sessions. Gives us a lot of feedback on how to retain clients. So how many made it 4 or more sessions? And then does the fidelity checklist and the clinical notes, do they indicate caregiver involvement or who was seen in the different sessions? Do they indicate how many sessions have been done in different phases of treatment? Are there goals that say you've met this part of the treatment model, and then you've met this part? And then a metric that you can't really weigh, but you can get back through qualitative data from families, because we need to be getting ongoing information from them on how do you think this is going? What do you need to help it? What would be the focus? When you think of that, qualitative data is, did you know what therapy you were receiving? Did you feel like you participated in and was included? Were your goals and needs prioritized? Are you more likely to seek mental health services in the future? So that would be your qualitative, some of your qualitative pieces to bring back. But as far as the performance evaluation and going back to fidelity monitoring, going back to that, it's what are the hard numbers? And is this particular clinician averaging about what's expected? And that should be in the job evaluation. It should be pointed out. And if possible, compared to, for you as the supervisor, compared to others who are using the same model in a similar situation. And that brings us to the importance of team building outside of just your CAC. But how do you connect with other CACs? How do you follow their metrics? How do you create learning teams with other CACs if you need to? Yeah, I see the question about how many cases should be on a clinical caseload, which goes to really, where is your clinician as far as self-care, as far as resiliency, trauma resiliency, stressors in their life right now. And where are they in learning a model? The more you know the model, the evidence-based practice, the easier actually trauma treatment becomes, because you know what you're doing. It takes away that factor of what in the world am I doing? And so clinicians tend to be able to take more trauma cases the more expert they become in a certain model, How many cases can they hold has a lot of variables to it. Some clinicians have all trauma-based cases. Some clinicians have half and half. You guys are a CAC. You're not treating a lot of just ADHD. You're not treating a lot of just learning disability frustration. You're not treating a lot of just autism spectrum disorder. You're treating all of those things in the context of trauma. So rather than how many cases on a clinician's caseload can there be versus other types of issues separated with assessment, I would say, how many can that clinician actually focus on and do good work, which brings you back to fidelity monitoring. If the clinician has more cases, and when they have more cases, they drift, they don't prepare for sessions, they don't follow the protocol, the fidelity sheet starts to look wonky, that clinician can't handle that many cases, at least not at that time. So how many can they keep with fidelity, and where are they in the learning process? When you send somebody to training, you got this little bell curve. And when you're thinking about fidelity, you would look at this and you would say, who do I need to worry about the most with fidelity? And it's going to be your top and your bottom. Traditionalists, because they don't want to use the model, so they're just not going to, right? Traditionalists. Innovators, they're often running, but they don't slow down enough to see what they're doing. They are slinging it like hash. I'm doing DBT, I'm doing TFCBT, I'm doing CPP, I'm doing whatever initials it is. I'm doing it with everybody, and we're doing the same thing in all the sessions, and look at the Play-Doh I bought. So innovators, you got to watch too. And that brings you back to fidelity. If somebody is a clinical supervisor, should they still be carrying a caseload? Should at least use the model. The best clinical supervisors for a particular model is a supervisor who has used the model and understands the complexities of actually delivering the model. So I really endorse that if you're going to be a clinical supervisor, you have used the model, at least have, if not still ongoing using. That also gives you some street cred on, yeah, this model can work because I've done it too. And it opens up that learning environment to, I make mistakes. In my training, I always try to put out there the mistakes I make on an ongoing basis. Fidelity is hard to maintain. So I like to share with people, this is where I drift. This is where I messed up. This is what my roadblock was, because it normalizes that we're going to have those as we're learning. So moving from training to actually using use them with consistency, requires consistent supervision. And I've left on this PowerPoint a lot of tips for good clinical supervision and what it is, and how you can think about it. Is there a protocol or a process that's really been put in place for clinical supervision? Is it prioritized? Is there time made for it? Is it recognized participation in, as well as excelling in the use of whatever model it is? Does it reflect assessing what is the trauma impact on your clinicians? So there's a lot of stuff in here about what a good clinical supervision would look like. But I'm also looking at the time. And Karen knows I can talk forever. So I'm going to open up for questions.
Yeah, I was just typing in the chat something that I think, all those questions that you just brought up, Kelly, around structured supervision, because while more and more of our CACs have mental health on site, there's still, in most, even if you're providing mental health services on site, you're brokering out some of those services to community partners as well.
Right.
And so all of those things that you just put in there about structured supervision and clinical supervision, if you're interviewing, looking for community partners to provide those mental health services, are fantastic questions to ask them about their process of clinical supervision and what does that look like in their organization.
And are they open for evaluation?
Yeah.
Will they participate in your team? You know, so you're going to be a private practice clinician out there, but will you participate in the team supervisions?
Exactly. And sometimes I hear pushback from CACs about, we're contracting them, they're the professionals, we take their word for it. And not that they're not professionals, but I'll be quite honest, it seems to me what I hear from a lot of trainers and mental health experts in the field is that, quite honestly, the level of supervision and the quality of mental health services is higher than in some community practices. Mm-hmm. And so not to just assume that because you're referring out that your kids are getting the quality mental health services that they need.
Right. A private practice clinician without any checks and balances and without a community can get a little scary. And one thing I would say, Karen, is that if you're brokering out, then just like you're going to evaluate if I actually did what I was supposed to on this webinar. And if I didn't, you're not going to use me again. So in brokering out services with CACs and other agencies that I've worked with, is that clinician open to participating in team meetings or supervisions? Is that clinician open to maintaining fidelity checklists that you can check? Is that clinician open to really providing feedback on what they're doing with a particular case and letting you know what the progress is? I wouldn't broker out services where it's just, here's this kid and family, and they need to come back to us when it's time for court. Do they stay a part of your learning team? Do they stay active? Do they make time for? And do they really come back to the CAC for questions they have around, what do I need to do with this particular case as far as the legal parts, or what do I need to do with this particular case as far as reevaluation or another forensic interview? Do they stay tied to your agency, or are they just floating out there? That's one of my big things.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Something else that kind of surfaced for me as I was listening to you talk about the metrics piece and the fidelity checklists, and those are available. And I did put in the chat, like the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse, that's a great place to go and learn more about the different EBPs and what are the target audiences. Same thing with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have lots of great information on the different evidence-based practices. I was looking at some of the NCA census data before this webinar, and far and away, TFCBT is the EBP that most of our CACs are using. But there is, a growing number of centers that are building out that EBP toolbox for their therapists, PCIT, EMDR,
CPP.
CPP. So that's all really good. Like the fidelity checklist, I was just able to Google and find on the TFCBT website. Where do you go to find these fidelity checklists if you've got different therapists using those? And so, like, my question for you was, I'm sitting here because I did therapy about, 125 years ago, before EBPs really, we were required to use them. That's how long ago it was. So if as a therapist, should they be using that fidelity checklist like with every client? Or what does that look like actually? If I am trying to evaluate my clinician's performance, I'm looking at their fidelity checklists. I loved what you talk about. Is there data around engagement and retention congruent with what's happening with other CACs? And I think state chapters are probably a really good place to go to find out what that looks like in your state. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming all of the national models have data around that too. But specifically, like that fidelity checklist, I'm wondering too about pre and post. Like, I know the trauma symptom checklist that actually show reduction in symptoms, trauma symptoms. Are those things I'm looking at as well?
Kind of going back and thinking, seeing if I get everything, okay?
Yeah, because that was 15 questions there, Kelly. I know, I'm sorry.
First is, if you are using an evidence-based practice, there should be fidelity monitoring tools. And you should be able to get those from the trainer, whoever your trainers are, whether it's a training outfit or it's a particular individual training. They should be able to go over fidelity with you as the organization, as the supervisor. And there should be a paper tool that can be used. Personally, I would have clinicians. The fidelity checklists are so easy. You're just writing down the date and what you've done. I would have a clinician keep one on every case, because that pulls back the focus of what am I doing here? What am I doing there? Checking the fidelity of that might be more of a spot check. So maybe they keep a fidelity checklist on each client, and at the end of each client's service, you get that fidelity checklist. So you have numbers that you can run through and you can look at, but you might either through peer review or your own personal review of the chart, does it match the fidelity checklist you're using on a particular case? So you'll pull out a sample size for that. You'll pull out a sample, and how are things going with each clinician around fidelity? That would also give you the ongoing measurements with the clinician. But if you have one on every case, you've got what you need for yearly and for annual evaluation too. And you really have good metrics to look at what are the patterns at my CAC. What are the patterns between the different clinicians? What are the, if you pair with a couple of other CACs around your area, how are we doing with our metrics? Are we all kind of matching up? Also gives you really good information for that contracted therapist. And you have a right to a fidelity checklist on every case you've sent to them if it's still tied to, if the CAC is still funneling the payment to that clinician, you have a right to check the fidelity checklist to look at, are you using the model we've asked you to use the way it's intended to be used?
I am seeing here, one of the things I was looking for, somebody is asking, how can you reach out for individual consultations that Kelly mentioned? I think part of the consultation you're talking about is part of TFCBT training and those consultation calls. I think it's a great question though, because I'm struck with, and I think this is something that we wrestle with, not just in mental health, but anything else. We think sending, one of the it's one of the biggest learnings I got out of the whole learning collaborative thing, Kelly, was really that just going to a training isn't going to change that practice. Mm-hmm. And so that's why those consultation calls are so important, because they're practicing those things that they learned and learning how to incorporate them and to change their practice with fidelity to the model. And that happens in the first year, but then what? And so I think that's, and Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like that's the intent of this question around, okay, they're done after that. Is clinical supervision that consultation? Are there other ways to get kind of that additional after the initial training? What's the next step for my folks?
What's the next step for my folks? How do I keep that learning environment going? How do I ensure that my seasoned clinicians are learning from my newly trained clinicians, what some of the changes are, what some of the applications that have been brought up are? How do I help how do my new clinicians learn from seasoned clinicians? All of that's really important. And looking at breaking out cases, I'm big on case consultation, on case conceptualization, and really being able to look at what are the needs of each case. But how do I do that with somebody else? Because I can do case conceptualization myself and miss a whole bunch of stuff. So I would take you back to problem-based learning there. What do we know? What do we need to know? What are our next steps? And that, if you look at the learning collaborative model, what are our roadblocks? If having ongoing consultation is a roadblock, then how do you want to get that? Do you want to contract for ongoing phone calls with a trainer? Maybe you want to partner with some other CACs to split that cost. Do you want to elevate your best users of the model, your seasoned clinicians who know what fidelity is? Do you want to elevate them to more of a consultation status? One important thing is consultation is not supervision. Really separating that out. Supervision is, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing, how you're supposed to be doing it, and how can I help you to do that? Consultation is case by case specific, or practice by practice specific, phase by phase specific, whatever. How do we do it here? We do a case presentation on every consultation call, because that really is how you learn an evidence-based practice. Is you use it, you see it being used by others, you listen to it. So an important part of your ongoing sustainability plan is, how do people hear other people's cases and give feedback and learn from them and normalize some of the things they're seeing? So different ways you can do it. I don't know if you want to join with other CACs to create a community. If you want to, like I said, want to elevate one or two clinicians who can be the experts on this model, and they get additional training, and then they're responsible for our consultations. Or if you want to contract with a trainer or a consultant, and how would you manage the costs for that?
Yeah, and I think, again, a lot of our chapters are doing some really good work around this. And it might be something that if you're trying to figure this out on your own, how do you provide and broker some of those clinical supervision services? Reaching out to your chapter to, get some insight and, maybe some guidance, or is it something the chapter might be willing to take on? There's some really cool work being done at the statewide level to support some of these skill development areas, like mental health, like forensic interviewing. That's hard for an individual center to do, but we can get some really innovative ideas at the state level.
I have some state levels that we do what's called ongoing calls, and clinicians are invited to come with specific case questions. They're invited to come and just listen at any time. They're not required to be there, or they can bring a specific case or a specific question to those. And that might be something you consider, and it could even be a peer learning experience. But do we want some kind of ongoing consultation where questions can really be explored and not just a quick answer given? Where do we go if you have a clinician who has one of those hard cases or one of those cases? Where do they get additional support for that? So whether it's peer consultation or you contract out consultation, I think that's a very important part of your ongoing development of a clinician, as well as your insurance that there's fidelity to the model and there's updated learning. Research comes out all the time about these different models. Changes happen all the time. Application manuals come into play. We see special populations where maybe my CAC doesn't have a lot of information on working with LGBTQ, but the one in another part of the state really does. Or maybe there's a learning thing on NCTSN you can go to and learn more about. But how do we do that? How do we make a group? How do we make it work for hard cases, I think, is what consultation does.
Yeah, and the thing too that I think about oftentimes, because for a lot of centers, having a therapist on staff is a huge achievement. And so, but I think about increasingly when folks are the only one in their agency doing that particular job, how isolating it is. So if I'm the only therapist at a CAC, and I don't have the opportunity to talk, get support from people doing the work that I'm doing, it really is a huge risk factor for secondary traumatic stress too. And so we do I think all of these ways that we're talking about supporting clinicians, yes, around fidelity of the model and figuring out really how to best serve kids and meet them where they are, that kind of thing. But it's also really important to prevent secondary traumatic stress so that you can really, these therapists can, their careers are sustainable for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That one, that they're sustainable secondary traumatic stress, it also goes into the learning environment and the preventing drift. And really helps clinicians, if they're working with other clinicians at other CACs, define what is their lane. One of the things I find with CACs where clinicians tend to start to burn out is they lose track of what is their lane, and they move into case management, or they move into court prep, or they move into, they're just spread into everything. And usually that is when they get the message that you have to fix the kid, or that the kid can't have any problems, the kid and family can't have any problems, or therapy's not working. So I find it very important to stay in your lane, because that gives therapists the ability to measure what they're doing versus a global measurement of assessment of functioning overall.
There's boy, Kelly, that's a whole webinar right there about the mental health clinician in context of the multidisciplinary team, and knowing your boundaries, because I'm just thinking how often an MDT says, let's send this kid to therapy to see if we can get a disclosure.
Yeah.
Or, those kinds of things that it does, the pressure on a therapist from the team to fix a kid that,
or to get the evidence, to get the disclosure, get the evidence, and what that, let's send them to a therapist to see if they make a better disclosure or a second disclosure, or they, can come back in for another interview for evidence. Think of the pressure that puts on the clinician and how much that's not compatible with trauma-focused evidence-based practices.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, there's a great question from Stephen. What are the risk indicators or targets that show fidelity is falling off or not being met in the middle of the ISP? If supervisors want to ensure fidelity before participant drop-off, or to be more actively involved in fidelity monitoring rather than retrospectively evaluating whether fidelity was met after discharge, or on regular performance evaluation cycles. Is it too complex or difficult to measure and monitor? What a great question. I don't know, Kelly.
Well, if you have a clinician who's using an evidence-based model, there's a protocol that's being followed and there's a time frame it's being done in. If they're using the fidelity checklist, then you should be able to pick up on that case at any point in time and see where they are and if that matches the protocol. At least that's one easy thing, right? How long have you been, or which component are you in, and how long have you been seeing this kid and family? It also allows you to, like I said before, good trauma-based therapy has 3 different phases. And are we focusing on what we need to focus on during this phase? So some of it is, if you're not mental health trained, is really orienting yourself to what should be happening at what point in the therapy. What would let me know that this is moving forward? And then the checking on cases in the middle are at different points. And also if you have a consultant who can come in and say, you know, on different cases, or even doing some spot checking, what's going on. So you can measure fidelity before the dropout. You can measure fidelity at any point in an evidence-based practice. TFCBT, you can measure fidelity 2 sessions in, 12 sessions in, whatever.
Yeah, that sounds good. It sounds like a capacity issue to a large extent, but a worthy one. I know you know Brian Miller, who does just fantastic work. But one of the things that he talks about is that we provide supervision for therapists for their own benefit, their learning. But at the end of the day, we're providing supervision for therapists because our kids need and deserve quality services. Mm-hmm. And so when this whole conversation around, you know, the fidelity, essentially it's holding therapists accountable to get good outcomes for kids, because that's what kids and families need. And so, you know, hearing him talk about that and talk about this in that way really shifted for me around the responsibility that leaders have to ensure that any clinician they're working with, whether it's on their staff or they're brokering those services out, that kids are getting quality services. And so what I like about Stephen's question here too is that it assumes that active participation and figuring out, this is hard, but this is doable. That's what I'm hearing from you today, Kelly. This is doable. I don't have to be a clinician to know if my clinicians are doing a good job. Mm-hmm. I just have to, you know, I've learned a lot about what I do need to know and be monitoring today. And I just need to carve out the time to make that a priority because our kids and families deserve it. That's what we're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And ethical treatment is, you know, we know the evidence-based practice works, but are you using it? I would think if you really wanted to learn how to measure fidelity on a specific treatment, schedule time for yourself with the trainer or with a consultant to really go over and practice measuring fidelity.
Wow, that's a great strategy, Kelly. Well, our time is up. Just quickly, Jennifer, I'm not avoiding your question about sample employee evaluations. I'm not sure that I've heard of that, but it seems to me like it's some about employee evaluations, but some about all of these strategies that we've talked about that are kind of along the way too, and more of a process of employee evaluation than a employee evaluation document that I might be using. The other thing is I'll add is I did put in, there is a CAC Director's Guide to Mental Health Services for Abused Children that NCTSN has on their website. I put that link in the chat for you guys as well. Kelly, thank you so much. We appreciate your commitment to evidence-based practices and your commitment to helping those of us in the CAC world figure out how to really provide the best help for kids and families. So thanks so much for you. And thanks everybody for listening. And just let us know how we can help support you as you support the clinicians that you're working with. Hope everybody has a great day and happy holidays to you all.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Karen.